to a brand new episode of the My Generation podcast. Hope you enjoy this brand new episode. I'm recording this on a completely new microphone, so let me know what you think of the audio quality of this episode, because it's going to probably sound a bit different in consistency with the rest of the episodes. We're trying to vary up the sounds of the podcast, bring together a new experience, and we're also outside, so hopefully there should be some beautiful evening ambience. It's 6 o'clock, middle of summer at the moment when I'm recording this. You're probably hearing it when it's not quite as summery, but hopefully it's still all lovely where you are. Today we're going to be talking about the movie Blade Runner 2049, and I want to talk about this movie because it's one of my favourites. It's, in my opinion, one of the best sequels of all time, and I just have a very close personal relationship with this movie. But before that, I also want to say that this is the first time that we're bringing a podcast episode to you in stereo, and what's making that different, hopefully for you, is if you're listening with headphones, should be able to hear sounds coming in and out of your left and right ear that are completely different in consistency with each other, and it should sound a little bit more real, a little bit more three-dimensional in terms of sound quality. I've got a car going past, so hopefully that actually sounds quite nice to you. And again, in the comments, let me know what you think of the sound quality of this episode. So the reason I wanted to talk about this movie are a few different categories. So I'm going to be talking about a sense of belonging, believing you are the one, connecting to individuals, doing what you are told, and the weight of memory. So I'm going to be talking about all of those different subjects in more detail. And to let you know now, we are going to be doing this as a spoiler-filled episode. So if you've seen the movie, do carry on listening to this podcast. If not, I definitely recommend going to watch it first. And if you don't mind spoilers, you can listen to this episode and then go and watch the movie, because I'd always recommend it. It's one of the best sequels I've ever seen, and a truly beautiful film. A sense of belonging. The reason I want to tackle this as a topic is mainly because of how, despite this being a science fiction movie, it has such weight to it. It has such a connection to what the everyday man feels. And the main protagonist, Kay, he is a replicant, and yet he is meant to be hunting replicants. So he has no real sense of belonging, because not only do the humans dislike him for what he is, but also the replicants, the original replicants from the old 1980s Blade Runner movie, because they're being hunted by him. So he has no real place, and he is stuck in a limbo. And I think it's a very relatable quality, the idea of having a sense of belonging, feeling like you have connection with a group of people, whether it be socially or in your workspace. I feel like this issue will actually strike hard with anyone who, whether in a job you don't feel like you're connecting to people around you, or a relationship, or a social circle where you don't feel like you can break in. Maybe you're in a brand new city. Kay, that he is based in, actually, there's quite an early scene in the movie where he's walking through the city he lives in, and they're so full and busy, and he's pushing through to get to his house, and he's got graffiti all over his door. He's got people pushing and shoving him that don't like him. And despite the fact he has a fairly high power position, I don't think he's enjoying his life at this stage in the movie. And I think that's his sense of belonging, and a sense of connection that you get with people once you find a group that you feel you really click with, not only just emotionally, but also on hobbies. You have like-minded interests. I feel like as the movie goes on, Kay meets people with the same sort of worldview as him, and shape his worldview into something that's a bit more three-dimensional and well-rounded, which helps him grow as a character. But he's only because he's being exposed to so many different people throughout the movie that he starts to realise this. Next, I wanted to talk about believing you are the one. So I think this is something that's really, really clever within this movie, which is the idea of being the one, being the only person who's there to save something, to save the world. You have Superman, you have Neo in the Matrix, all these people who are the one within their movies' context or lore or canon, and the idea that the world can't be saved without that one, the idea that if this person wasn't in existence, they wouldn't be able to stop any of the bad things that take place. But what Blade Runner 2049 does is it establishes early on in the movie the idea of a one, with the memories of someone being implanted, or a replicant's actually receiving real memories, which is illegal within the film's universe. And Kay thinks he is this one. And for a large early portion of the movie, that carries him through, the idea of him believing he is special. And throughout the movie, he learns that apparently others also thought that they were the one and that they were special. And I find that fascinating, because he was driven not only by a search for knowledge, but when he starts to think that it is him, it's absolutely ramped up, because he's trying to do this not only for the sake of the world, but also because he thinks it's his duty. He thinks he's taken on a responsibility. And I find it interesting that maybe he wouldn't have done what he had done within the movie had he not believed that it was him who had the real memories, and that all those coincidences that were lining up were actually leading to him being the child of a replicant and a human together. He believes this, and it carries him through a large portion of the movie. I think the ultimate twisting and turning point is when he realizes he isn't the one, but carries on anyway. He carries on because he actually realizes what the mission is really about, and that it's not about him, it's about something greater than him. He becomes a cog in the machine, the everyman, the person who is just there to do a job. And inadvertently, he kind of becomes the one, not only because he has actually taken the steps to save people, do what's right, but he's also put himself in that difficult position, despite the fact he knows he has nothing special about him, and that he is just like any other replicant. And I think that's ultimately what is the most powerful and strong to learn from his story, is that he wasn't the one. He wasn't anything unique, but yet he went and did it anyway. Next is connecting to an individual. There are some very interesting scenes throughout the movie relating to joy and isolation. Some that homage to a movie called Her by Spike Jonze, which came out in 2013. I've mentioned that movie a few times on the podcast. The last time I recorded an episode outside was episode 8, where I talked about films that changed you. And so if you want to go back and listen to some of that content, you can, although the audio quality is not as good as this mic. Again, wanting you to let me know what you think of this. I'm also using a mic cover, so hopefully if there's any wind, fingers crossed it's all not there. Now, connecting with an individual. There's a scene within the movie where Joy gets someone in, and they sort of morph together so that it's an AI's personality, but it's also a real person, so Joy can experience the feeling of really being in love. And Kay's going along with this. He has one of those Joy units installed anyway, which gives you the impression that he feels alone and like he isn't going to connect with a person. And I feel like in our modern context, in our modern world, this is actually a very real worry that people have. The idea of not ever feeling like you're really going to connect to a person because of how many people there are and how everyone seems to have a direction or a place to go. A social presence, social media, they're always looking at their phone, they're not willing to talk to new people or strangers. How do you meet new people? How do you go out there and find someone you haven't met before? And I think that Kay ultimately has that understanding. And I find that quite interesting within his character's context, because he has the position, he has the pedigree, but yet he still feels that. He still feels like he has absolutely no connection to anyone, because he is stuck. He's stuck in an interesting position, which is that he has no family, no friends within the movie. With being one of those replicants, he is effectively born into this kind of situation, and no one to really relate to. So I find it very interesting, the idea of how the film treats this subject matter, because you are forced, almost in a way, to understand and sympathise with a situation, because again, with our modern social media driven world, a lot of connections to what happens in Japan, with many, actually very high suicide rates due to loneliness, through everyone being connected on their smartphones, but especially in cities like London or Tokyo, where everything seems so busy and so fast, and yet there's not actually that time to slow down. I've been up to London fairly recently, and whilst I absolutely adore the city, I still get that same reoccurring feeling of such a high pace but a very low social interaction. I get a feeling of this place is busy and moving and breathing and living, but it's hard to almost break into this place when you don't know anyone in it. There's an interesting way this is tackled within the movie Midnight in Paris, where on the surface there appears to be next to no way of getting into sort of the underbelly of Paris, where people really start to enjoy the city. There's actually, I believe something called Paris syndrome, where people expect the city to come across as better than it actually does on the surface and be more romantic than it actually is. But it's almost impossible to break into that underbelly of the city where the real passion and energy is happening, because it's not sold that way. It's sold, you're sold an image of Paris where it is the underworld, it is the underbelly where everything is going on. It's not that realistic unless you know someone or are way in, and I think that's why the connecting with an individual element of Blade Runner is very interesting. Also, when we eventually figure out who is the one, and who is the one who was born as a result of a human and a replicant, the connection that Kay and her have is very interesting. Their interactions, they feel like they actually connect to each other, and it's the first time really in the movie I feel like you see two people able to show emotion to each other, which I find very passionate. And because he's able to talk, they're able to shed a tear. It's reuniting family, and people actually being able to open up in a modern world, which is I think something that's very, very topical at the moment. And next, the subject of doing what you are told. So I think there's, in terms of compliance and just naturally following order, Kay has an interesting arc in the fact that he starts off just following what everyone tells him to. He does exactly what he's told, and as a result, he makes decisions based on just the people above him. And because he just makes decisions based on the people around him, he never ends up actually gaining an identity, really. And I think that some people might feel resonant to this due to how in a social context, in a social world, we are so influenced by Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, what it feeds us, the fact that if we're subscribed to certain points of view, we will always believe those certain points of view because we are having some of them regurgitated in what it thinks that we should be listening to. And that if you have certain beliefs, they can be heightened or made more strong because people also, with the same beliefs, are what you see. So you end up doing what you're told, maybe within a work or a job context, maybe in a social or political context, and only throughout the movie does Kay learn how to deal with this, because he is exposed to people who don't comply with the rules, who actually do go away. It's that the rebellious group at the end, I think straight after Deckard's found and then taken away by Love and Wallace, that's when he does all of his learning in the movie, because he's exposed to that band of rebels who have finally managed to break free. And I find that very interesting within his character arc. Those characters are the most influential to him throughout the movie, and the fact that Joy herself, or the one that Kay has installed, has also been able to break free in her own way. And lastly, the last thing I wanted to talk about before wrapping up the episode is the weight of memory, because most of this story is centered around the discovery of someone who is born by a replicant and a human, but the way that the clues are opened up are through the subject of memory, having a real memory implanted into someone who hasn't actually experienced the memory. And what sparks my curiosity about this subject is the weight of a memory, having it implanted into you. Within the movie's context, Kay is very much aware that his memories are all constructs, but seems to be unfazed by it because it's how he's always lived. But yet he is aware that what he has thought about is fake. And I almost find it more interesting that they didn't install some way within the movie so that the replicants believed their memories were true, because the line blurs as to what is a real and what is a fake memory, the point he came into existence and how everything before that was not real. Because then how much weight do you put on your own memories? Because all memories are slightly obscured as time goes on. You'll forget details, you'll have personal biases, memories change based on the emotion you were feeling at the time when you experience them. And I think that each and every memory is so complex and individual, but yet they all are so malleable, and they change through time. Stories do as well, when you tell friends and family stories. But do they make you up entirely? Are you just the sum of your stories that you tell? I'd argue not, because Kay does also argue that he is experiencing a life in front of him, but at the start he is very swallowed up by the fact that his memories could be real, and that changes him. He starts to think that just because the memory is now real, it has another level of weight to it. What is the true value of a memory? It's a very potent question that the film poses. Why would someone put a real memory into a replicant to make them that one, to make them that person who has a real human memory embedded? Why would they put them through that? Because ultimately that Kay's journey is, he's struggling with the idea of something that was real versus fake. There's the idea of any memory being a reality in its entirety, and that might seem like a more pessimistic approach to the idea of memories, but I think that whilst they are still so important, and building great and strong memories is an absolute must, they don't decide the future entirely. You can have negative memories and still move on and make better new ones, because whilst it may have happened, the memory will always be just a version of that event. And I think that's what Kay also slowly begins to realise throughout the movie, is that the memory being true or not isn't actually the point of this. It's when he starts to strip his ego back and lose his sense of himself and just becomes one with the bigger picture, because the bigger picture is what this was always about. And a lot of the movie is spent with him realising that it's not actually his story in the slightest, and only in the final couple of scenes do we really realise that this is not about him in the slightest, yet also entirely about him, as he's the only one willing to act. So I hope you enjoyed just my brief thoughts on Blade Runner 2049. This is a shorter podcast episode, considerably shorter than many others that I have recorded in very recent time. Apologise if there's been any noises of sort of cars that have maybe interrupted the episode slightly. I've been recording out here in the sort of beautiful countryside area, but it's sort of nearer a road, so cars have been coming in and out, and I hope that's not distracted too much from the content of this show. It's been really nice recording out here, beautiful little bit of summer weather. If there's any other films you want me to review or watch, please let me know, because anything with sci-fi, philosophy are major subjects that I love talking about, and would be very interested in touching on again, because I want to talk about Her, The Fountain, a lot more in detail. If there's specific examples, please do let me know in the comments, because I will talk about whatever you guys want me to see. We're also now on Soundcloud. Soundcloud's our first new service that this podcast is coming out on, because traditionally up until this point we've only been a YouTube podcast. And so if you're listening on SoundCloud, thank you very much for tuning in. We also have a Twitter page that's also now added to the description of the YouTube video and SoundCloud. And we are also trying to get this out on Apple Podcasts, so hopefully by the time you're listening to this, we're out on Apple Podcasts. So if you're listening there, thank you very much, on all other streaming services provided. So new links are added into the description. On Twitter, I'm going to be asking loads more questions for the podcast, so if you have any inclination to try and contribute to the show, I'd absolutely love to have your comments in, or feature you on the podcast as well. So do drop me a message on the Twitter page. We're always asking questions for new podcast episodes, because we want to get the voice of the people out into this show through the many coming episodes. And I want to know what you prefer in terms of listening. Do you like these episodes where it's just me and you talking, quite a casual format? Or would you prefer me to maybe go back to the interviews more? Because I'm trying to mix it up, do a bit of both. We had Tom on last week talking about costume design within the sci-fi universe of Star Wars. So that was very interesting. We've got Dan Inwood coming back for another episode. We absolutely love getting him on the show, and that's going to be a bit more of a comedic one, I think. But that's just my brief thoughts on Blade Runner 2049. Thoughts about the movie, leave them in the YouTube comments, or you can find the Facebook and Twitter and reach me that way as well. I've also got email, and if you want to feature on the podcast, we're always looking for guests. We love talking about creative arts, science fiction, photography, or any sport or hobbies you do. Anything that makes you tick is what I'm really interested in talking about on the show, and this is a movie I've been thinking about ever since its release, and I know there's so much more to talk about relating to it. There is a YouTube channel called Like Stories of Old, which I'm going to recommend to you because they have an amazing video on Blade Runner 2049, and it's about its sense of humanity, and I think they do an even better job than me talking about the subject. So maybe some of the points I've said here might slightly overlap, but I'd recommend listening to that in its entirety as well. Thank you very much for listening to today's episode of the My Generation podcast, and I'll catch you next week for another episode. Thank you very much for listening.